The shouting starts before dawn, long before the assembly is formally called. In Athens, in 406 BC, citizens are already gathering in the streets that slope toward the Pnyx, drawn out of their homes by something that does not feel like victory. Men who should be opening shops or heading to the docks stand in tight groups instead, speaking in low bursts or not speaking at all. Some are angry, some hollowed out, most waiting to hear names. The naval battle at Arginusi is over. Athens has won when it could not afford to lose. And yet the city feels unsteady, as if the ground beneath it has shifted rather than solidified. People arrive carrying fragments that feel like evidence. A length of rope pulled from the harbor, stiff with salt. A plank torn from a trireme, one end splintered by impact. Others carry nothing at all, only absence that refuses to stay private. A son who sailed and did not return. A brother whose ship was seen during the fighting and then vanished. Victory has reached Athens, but it has arrived tangled with something unresolved. Out at sea, the generals are still being praised. In the city, the counting has already begun, and too many numbers do not line up. This story follows Athens at the moment when winning stopped being enough. Survival did not bring relief, and success did not close the wound it was meant to seal. Instead, ordinary citizens, acting through their own laws and institutions, begin moving toward a decision that will change how the city understands itself. Not because democracy collapses, but because it is pushed into a role it was never designed to play. If you want more stories that follow power to the moment it breaks, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment with the question that stays with you as we go. When a city is hurting, what does it reach for first? Justice or release? The battle near Arginusi had been fought under pressure from the start. Athens was deep into a long war, drained of money, short of experienced crews, and surrounded by enemies waiting for exhaustion to finish the job. The fleet that sailed that summer was assembled from necessity, not confidence. Slaves were promised freedom. Foreigners were promised citizenship. Ships were crewed by men who had never expected to row in a decisive engagement, let alone one that would decide whether the city would keep control of the sea lanes that fed it. The generals knew what failure would mean. A defeat here would open the Aegean to Sparta and its allies. Grain shipments would slow, then stop. Hunger would do what enemy fleets had not. When the two sides met, there was no margin for retreat. The fighting was close, chaotic, and improvised. Signals were missed and guessed at. Command shifted ship by ship as captains acted on instinct more than orders. By the time the enemy fleet broke and withdrew, Athens was still alive, and for a brief moment that felt like enough. The sea did not allow that moment to last. The weather turned quickly while damaged ships were still drifting among the wreckage. Wind rose first, then waves that struck hulls already weakened by battle. Formations dissolved as captains fought simply to keep their ships afloat. Orders were shouted and lost in the noise. Some crews tried to turn back toward men in the water. Others judged the risk too great and kept moving. Rescue depended on the storm easing, and everyone could see that it was not going to. When the sea finally calmed, hundreds were gone. In Athens, news of the victory arrived before news of the loss. Sacrifices were offered. The gods were thanked. The names of the generals were spoken with relief after years of strain and compromise. Then families began going down to the harbor looking for ships that never arrived. Names were read aloud and marked off lists that grew shorter than expected. Fathers asked which trireme their sons had been assigned to. Wives compared fragments of survivor accounts. Brothers argued over what had been seen clearly and what had only been assumed. The gaps did not close. The absence began to demand explanation. By the time the assembly is finally called to order, Athens is no longer celebrating. It is counting, questioning, and watching its own leaders more closely than it ever has before. Victory has been secured, but the scale of what was lost is only starting to surface, and the city has not yet decided what it is supposed to do with that knowledge. In the days that follow the first assembly, Athens does not settle. It circulates. Grief does not retreat into private spaces or exhaust itself in ritual. It moves through the city in conversation, in rumor, in argument. Men meet each other in the streets and repeat the same questions with different emphasis. Who gave the order? Who chose not to turn back? At what point did rescue stop being attempted and start being abandoned? No answer holds for long, and uncertainty begins to feel less like ignorance and more like concealment. The harbor becomes a focal point for this unease. Families return again and again, not because they expect new ships to arrive, but because standing there feels like action. Survivors are stopped and questioned, sometimes gently, sometimes not. Their accounts rarely match. One remembers the wind rising suddenly. Another remembers a ship turning away, while men were still visible in the water. Each story is incomplete, but together they form a pattern of doubt that feels more convincing than any official explanation. Without bodies, grief has no boundary. There are no funerals to mark an ending, no ashes to carry home, no public moment when mourning is supposed to give way to acceptance. In Athens, burial is not symbolic. It is obligation, law, and belief woven together. To leave the dead unburied is to leave them unsettled and to leave their families exposed. The absence of remains becomes an accusation in itself, one that presses outward into public life. The generals remain alive, visible, and intact, and that contrast matters more with each passing day. They walk through the city as free men while hundreds remain unrecovered. Their earlier praise now feels unresolved, even premature. People begin to ask whether honor has been distributed too quickly before the full cost of victory was understood. The question is not yet hostile, but it is persistent, and persistence has its own momentum. Another assembly is called, and the crowd is larger than before. People arrive with their arguments already shaped, reinforced by days of repetition. Speakers rise not to explore possibilities, but to confirm what many already feel. The storm is mentioned less often. Weather is unpredictable. Responsibility, they argue, is not. The focus shifts from what could not be controlled to what should have been anticipated. The generals speak again, returning to the same facts. Ships were damaged. Crews were exhausted. The risk of losing more men was real. They insist that commanders cannot be expected to sacrifice the fleet to recover the fallen. They frame the decision as tragic but unavoidable. Some listeners accept this. Others hear calculation where they want contrition. The explanation grows more complicated when the generals distribute responsibility. Rescue, they say, was assigned to subordinate commanders while the main fleet regrouped. Those men, too, were prevented by the storm. The attempt to clarify instead widens the field of blame. More names enter the conversation. More uncertainty follows. Instead of closure, the city feels distance opening between decision and consequence. For many families, this sounds like evasion. The victory had been claimed collectively, with the generals at its center. Now the failure feels dispersed, difficult to pin down. Suspicion grows not because the explanation is implausible, but because it does not satisfy the emotional demand for accountability. The city is no longer asking what happened. It is asking who must answer for it. Legal language begins to surface more frequently, not as reassurance, but as friction. Citizens remind one another that officials can be charged for failure in office. Others counter that no law demands impossible rescue. The debate does not resolve these points, it hardens them. Each side hears the other as refusal rather than disagreement. Outside the assembly, the tone shifts as well. Conversations become less exploratory and more declarative. People begin to speak in terms of outcomes rather than investigations. Exile is mentioned, then dismissed. Fines are laughed at. The scale of loss demands something heavier, something that feels equal to the wound. Even those uneasy with this direction sense that the city is moving faster than their caution. By the end of the week, grief has changed shape. It is no longer raw sorrow or disbelief. It has become expectation. Something must be done. Someone must be held. The longer the city waits, the more that waiting itself feels like another failure. Athens has not yet decided how it will act, but it has decided that inaction is no longer acceptable, and that decision is beginning to narrow every path forward. By the time the next assembly meets, the mood has shifted from grief to demand. People no longer arrive to listen and weigh possibilities. They arrive expecting movement. Days of argument have hardened opinion, and uncertainty now feels like a threat in itself. The storm that once dominated every explanation recedes into the background, replaced by a sharper focus on responsibility. Athens is no longer asking what happened at sea. It is asking whether its leaders can be judged at all. The assembly opens with familiar procedure, but the tone is strained. Speakers are interrupted more often, not by shouting but by impatience. Long explanations lose the room. Short, decisive statements carry weight. The legal framework governing trials is cited repeatedly, not because it reassures anyone, but because it is under pressure. Each reminder that generals are entitled to individual hearings sounds less like protection and more like obstruction to those who want resolution. A proposal is introduced to accelerate proceedings. It is framed as necessity rather than ambition. The city is still at war. Morale is fragile, and delay, the speaker argues, benefits no one but those already in power. The generals failed to recover the dead, and that failure is plain enough to act on. Speed in this framing becomes a form of care for a wounded city, rather than a threat to justice. Objections follow immediately. Another citizen warns that collapsing multiple cases into a single process abandons safeguards meant to protect everyone, not just the accused. He argues that urgency does not justify changing how guilt is determined. His words are measured, careful, and increasingly out of step with the room. People listen, but the argument does not travel far. It asks for patience at a moment when patience feels indistinguishable from avoidance. The generals sense the change and adjust their defense. They lean less on the storm and more on precedent. Commanders, they argue, have always been granted discretion in battle. Weather cannot be legislated away. If decisions made under such conditions are punished, future leaders will hesitate when boldness is required. The city's enemies will not. The warning is clear, but its effect is mixed. To some, it sounds prudent. To others, it sounds like a threat disguised as caution. A counter-argument gains traction quickly. If commanders cannot be held accountable when their decisions leave citizens unburied, then what limits their authority at all? Victory, this speaker insists, cannot be a shield against consequence. If success excuses every failure, then defeat becomes the only crime. The logic is simple, emotionally legible, and easy to repeat. It spreads through the assembly faster than any technical rebuttal. The debate shifts away from the specifics of argonusae and toward the structure of power itself. The assembly is no longer deciding whether the generals acted reasonably. It is deciding how much discretion leaders should be allowed when lives are lost. Two versions of democracy begin to clash. One prioritizes restraint and procedure. The other prioritizes responsiveness to collective pain. Both claim legitimacy. Only one feels urgent. Outside the assembly, conversation has already moved ahead. Citizens speak openly about punishment, not investigation. Exile is dismissed as insufficient. Fines are ridiculed as symbolic. Execution, once unthinkable for victorious commanders, enters discussion as a proportionate response to the scale of loss. The idea shocks some, but fewer than before. Repetition dulls resistance. When the vote on procedure is finally taken, it is narrow but decisive. The generals will be tried together as a group by a single decision of the assembly. The law has not been erased. It has been bent by popular will. From this point forward, the city's path narrows. Athens has not yet decided the fate of its generals, but it has decided that restraint will no longer slow judgment, and that choice will shape everything that follows. The decision to try the generals together is meant to simplify matters, but it has the opposite effect. Instead of narrowing the question, it binds every grievance into a single charge, forcing the assembly to confront loss in the abstract rather than responsibility in detail. What might have been 8 separate reckonings becomes one collective judgment, and that scale magnifies emotion rather than containing it. Citizens who might have hesitated to condemn one man now feel justified condemning a group because the punishment begins to resemble restoration rather than vengeance. An attempt is made to restore order through compromise. A motion is proposed to delay sentencing until after a formal review of testimony, framed as a way to respect the law without ignoring public demand. It sounds reasonable. It also arrives too late. To many in the crowd, delay now looks like retreat, and retreat feels like betrayal of the dead. The proposal is debated briefly, then rejected, not because it is unlawful, but because it threatens to reopen uncertainty at a moment when certainty feels essential. The generals sense that procedure is slipping out of reach and make one last effort to adapt. They concede failure without conceding guilt, acknowledging that the dead were not recovered while insisting that no order was given to abandon them. The distinction matters legally, but it lands poorly. To the assembly, it sounds like evasion wrapped in precision. The city is no longer separating intent from outcome. The bodies are missing. That fact outweighs every clarification offered in response. As the debate continues, the emotional center of the room shifts again. Speakers stop addressing the generals and begin addressing one another. The question becomes less about what happened at sea and more about what kind of city Athens believes itself to be under strain. If leaders are spared because they acted in crisis, what message does that send to families who bore the cost? If law slows response, is law still serving the people or shielding those with power? A procedural maneuver is introduced to force a single immediate vote on guilt and punishment together. It is openly acknowledged that this departs from normal practice, but the justification is blunt. The city cannot endure another cycle of speeches while the dead remain unanswered. The measure is controversial, but it appeals to exhaustion. Many citizens feel trapped between rules that promise fairness and grief that demands action. The maneuver offers escape from that tension by collapsing choice into one decisive act. The vote to proceed passes. With it, the last meaningful break is removed. The assembly has not declared the generals guilty yet, but it has committed itself to a process that makes acquittal nearly impossible. In choosing speed over separation, Athens signals that restoring emotional balance now matters more than preserving procedural distance. The attempt to adapt has failed. Instead of stabilizing the situation, it has locked the city into a course where reversal will feel indistinguishable from weakness and where punishment begins to look like the only remaining form of control. Once the assembly commits to a single, accelerated judgment, everything that follows feels compressed. Debate continues, but it no longer opens possibilities. It narrows them. Speakers rise knowing the direction of travel and adjust their words accordingly, not to persuade the undecided, but to align themselves with what now feels inevitable. The legal framework remains visible, cited and referenced, yet it functions more as vocabulary than restraint. Each procedural reminder is met with an emotional counterweight: the unburied dead, the unanswered families, the sense that delay itself has become a form of injustice. In this atmosphere, caution begins to look like complicity, and restraint starts to resemble refusal to acknowledge suffering. The generals are still allowed to speak, but the terms have shifted. Their defenses are heard through a new filter, one that assumes failure first and explanation second. When they return again to the storm, to damaged ships, to the risk of losing even more men, the words feel recycled, stripped of their original force. The assembly no longer hears context, it hears justification. Each appeal to circumstance reinforces the impression that leaders believe themselves insulated from consequences that ordinary citizens must bear. The gap between command and cost widens, and resentment fills it quickly. Around the city, the language of punishment hardens. Conversations no longer circle around what the law permits, but around what feels equal to the loss endured. Lesser penalties are discussed only to be dismissed. Exile would leave the generals alive. Fines would leave them comfortable. Both feel out of proportion to the image of men left clinging to wreckage until the sea took them. Execution, once a distant possibility, begins to sound less like excess and more like symmetry. The severity of the response becomes proof, to some, that the city understands the scale of its own wound. What makes this turn especially powerful is that it is not driven by a single demagogue or faction. It is collective, diffuse, reinforced by repetition rather than command. No one needs to argue that the generals are enemies of the state. It is enough to suggest that accountability must be visible and final. The democracy does not feel hijacked in this moment. It feels activated. Citizens recognize their own voices in the rising demand for decisive action, and that recognition makes resistance harder to sustain. Even those who feel uneasy sense the pressure closing in. To argue for restraint now is to risk appearing indifferent to the dead or protective of elites. Silence becomes safer than objection. The assembly's energy feeds on itself, each expression of certainty encouraging the next. By the time the question of punishment is formally framed, the emotional work has already been done. The city has not yet raised its hands to vote, but it has largely accepted that whatever happens next must be irreversible. And that reversal itself would feel like betrayal. As the session draws toward its conclusion, Athens crosses an invisible line. The democratic process remains intact in form, but its purpose has subtly changed. It is no longer a tool for weighing outcomes. It has become a mechanism for absorbing grief and converting it into action. The decision that looms is not yet spoken aloud, but its shape is clear, and the city moves toward it with the grim confidence of people who believe that only finality can restore balance. The final assembly meets with a quiet that feels deliberate rather than calm. The arguments have been made so many times that repetition has stripped them of urgency. What remains is decision. The generals are brought forward together, not as individuals with distinct records, but as a single body onto which the city has already projected its judgment. There is no ceremony, no attempt to mark the moment as tragic or exceptional. The process continues because it has been set in motion, and stopping now would require an admission that the city no longer seems willing to make. The vote is framed plainly. Guilt and punishment are bound together, presented as one question rather than two. The law allows this, even if it does not encourage it, and that distinction is no longer debated. Hands are raised in public view, as they always are. The count does not require precision. It only needs to be clear enough to end resistance. It is not unanimous. It does not need to be. In that moment, the generals cease to be commanders or defendants. They become the chosen answer to a problem that has demanded an ending. There is no celebration when the result is announced. No sense of release passes through the crowd. The room absorbs the decision in silence, broken only by small movements as people shift their weight or avert their eyes. The judgment has been delivered by the citizens themselves, and that fact presses heavily on the space. Responsibility cannot be deflected upward or outward. It sits with the assembly, shared and inescapable. The executions follow quickly, not because haste is required, but because hesitation has already been exhausted. The city has argued itself past the point where reversal feels possible. To delay now would be to reopen wounds that people are desperate to close. The generals are led away under guard, not through hostile crowds, but through streets that have gone unnaturally quiet. People step aside without shouting or approval, watching in silence as the men who saved the city are removed by the same system they once served. Accounts of the deaths vary in detail, but the fact itself does not. 6 of the 8 generals who commanded at Arginusi are put to death by Athens. Their service does not spare them. Their victory does not protect them. The storm that shaped every earlier argument disappears from memory almost immediately, as if the city no longer needs it to justify what has been done. What mattered was not the weather, but the outcome that could be seen and measured. In the days that follow, Athens does not collapse. The assembly continues to meet. The courts continue to function. The war continues. On the surface, the system appears intact, even reinforced by decisive action. Many citizens believe the city has proven its resolve, that it has shown leaders cannot act without consequence. Yet something subtler begins to surface alongside this confidence. Conversations turn inward. Doubts emerge quietly. Not about the loss itself, but about whether the response truly addressed it. The sailors lost at sea are never recovered. Their families perform symbolic rites in place of proper burials, marking absence rather than presence. The executions do not bring the dead home. They do not shorten the war. What they do is leave Athens with a new understanding of itself. The city learns that under enough pressure, it will choose certainty over restraint and finality over patience. That knowledge does not fade. It settles into political memory, a warning carried forward long after the immediate crisis has passed. Thank you for watching. If this story sparked something in you, please subscribe and turn on notifications. When a society is pushed to the edge by grief and fear, should its laws bend to deliver relief or stand firm even when the cost feels unbearable? Let's discuss in the comments below.